The blizzard raged, a fury of white screaming across the Montana plains. For old Silas Blackwood, it was just another Tuesday. He'd seen storms that could swallow a house whole and spit out the splinters. This one was mean, but his ranch, the Blackwood Steads, had stood for 100 years. It would stand for another 100. He was stoking the fire in his hearth, the flames casting dancing shadows on the worn leather of his armchair when he heard it. A faint, desperate cry, nearly eaten by the wind. He paused, his hand hovering over the log pile. It couldn't be. Nobody in their right mind would be out in this. But there it was again, clearer this time. A child's voice. Cursing the cold and his own aging bones, Silas pulled on his heaviest coat, grabbed his storm lantern, and stepped out into the howling chaos. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving icy needles into his weathered face. He followed the sound, a ghost of a wail that led him toward the old northern fence line. And there, huddled against a snow-drifted post, was a small figure, barely visible. A boy, no older than 10, his face pale and his lips tinged with blue. He was shivering violently, his thin jacket no match for the storm's fury. Silas scooped him up. The boy was light as a feather, his small body trembling uncontrollably. Back in the warmth of the cabin, Silas wrapped the child in a thick wool blanket and sat him by the fire, plying him with hot cocoa. "Where are your folks, son?" Silas asked, his voice a low rumble. The boy, teeth chattering, could only point a shaky finger back into the storm. "Car. It slid off the road. Mama, she told me to find help." Silas's heart sank. The old mountain pass was a death trap in this weather. He radioed the sheriff, giving the location as best as the boy could describe. All they could do now was wait. The boy was starting to thaw out, the color returning to his cheeks. "What's your name, kid?" Silas asked, trying to keep his tone light. The boy looked up, his eyes wide and dark in the firelight. "Leo," he whispered. "Leo Blackwood." Silas froze. The tin mug of cocoa slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the floorboards. The hot liquid seeping into the ancient wood. Blackwood. It was his name. A name that was supposed to die with him. He was the last of his line, a bachelor who'd never married, never had children. He stared at the boy, who looked back at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. Who was this child? How could he possibly carry the same name? The sheriff's call came an hour later. They'd found the car. A woman was inside, unconscious but alive. They were airlifting her to the hospital in Billings. Silas relayed the news to Leo, who sagged with relief. "She's gonna be okay," Silas promised, though he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. Days turned into a week. The storm passed, leaving a world blanketed in pristine white. Leo's mother, Sarah, was in a medically induced coma. And Leo stayed with Silas. The old ranch, usually a place of profound silence, was now filled with the boy's questions, his laughter, his very presence. Silas found himself teaching the boy how to mend a fence, how to check on the cattle, how to read the sky. He was a natural, his hands small but sure, his eyes bright with intelligence. It was like looking at a faded photograph of himself, a lifetime ago. One afternoon, while cleaning out a dusty storage room, Leo stumbled upon an old leather-bound trunk. "What's in here, Mr. Blackwood?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Silas's heart skipped a beat. "Just old memories, son. Things best left buried." But Leo's pleading eyes were hard to resist. With a heavy sigh, Silas knelt and unlatched the trunk. Inside, nestled amongst faded quilts and old tools, were letters tied with a ribbon and a small, tarnished silver locket. Leo picked up the locket, his small fingers fumbling with the clasp. It sprang open. Inside were 2 miniature portraits. One was of a young, handsome man with familiar, stern eyes, a much younger Silas. The other was of a beautiful young woman with a radiant smile. "Who is she?" Leo breathed, tracing the woman's face with his fingertip. A wave of pain, old and deep, washed over Silas. "Her name was Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was—" A long time ago, he had loved Eleanor with all the fierce passion of his youth. They were supposed to get married, to build a life on this ranch. But his own pride, a stupid argument, had driven her away. She'd left town, and he'd never seen her again. He never knew what became of her. Leo looked from the locket to Silas. "My grandma's name was Eleanor," he said softly. "She died before I was born. Mom says she grew up around here." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Silas stared at the boy, truly seeing him for the first time. The dark, intelligent eyes, the shape of his face, it was all there. Eleanor's legacy. His legacy. He fumbled through the letters, his hands shaking. They were from Eleanor, written after she'd left. Letters he had refused to open, returned to sender in a fit of stubborn pride. Now he tore one open. Her elegant script flowed across the page, telling him of a new life in another state, of her regret, and of the secret she carried. A baby. A son. His son. A son she had raised on her own, giving him her new husband's name, but never forgetting his true heritage. Silas sank to the floor, the letter clutched in his hand. Decades of loneliness, of bitter regret, crashed down on him. All this time he had a family. A son, and now a grandson. A grandson brought to his very door by a storm, as if fate itself had decided it was time for the truth to be known. When Sarah finally woke up, Silas was by her bedside. He introduced himself not just as the man who saved her son, but as her father-in-law. The story tumbled out, a confession of a lifetime of regret. Sarah, her eyes filled with tears, listened. She told him about her husband, Silas's son. A good man who had died in a car accident 2 years prior, a man who never knew his real father. She had been coming to Montana, following a clue from her mother-in-law Eleanor's old diaries, hoping to find some trace of her husband's family for Leo's sake. The old rancher looked at his grandson, who was now his heir. The storm hadn't brought destruction. It had brought redemption. The Blackwoodsteads would not fall silent. A new chapter had begun, written by a blizzard, sealed by a locket, and delivered in the form of a small boy named Leo Blackwood. The fire in the hearth burned brighter than ever, warming not just a house, but a family finally whole. The wind that night didn't scream. It roared. A raw, merciless cry rolling across the Wyoming plains like some hungry spirit searching for anything warm to devour. Folks in the frontier town of Cedar Hollow would speak of that storm for years. How it arrived without mercy, swallowing cabins, cattle, and whole hopes in white silence. But on the far edge of that wilderness, in a lonely stretch of snow that had no footprints before that evening, a man rode with his head down and his coat pulled tight against the sleet. His name was Luke Harrow, a rancher by labor, a loner by choice, and a man whose heart had been caving in on itself for nearly 10 years. Everything he loved had been buried long before that storm. Luke had spent the day driving cattle down a ridge, but the blizzard hit early, pushing him far from his usual trail. By sundown, he could hardly see the ears of his horse, Dusty. Snow slapped his face like cold knives, and Luke's breath came out in sharp bursts that vanished instantly into the white. Most men would have turned back. But Luke Harrow wasn't most men. He kept riding because he learned a long time ago that stopping in a storm kills quicker than the cold. And because somewhere deep in his bones, he knew storms weren't always accidents. Sometimes, they brought messages. Sometimes, they brought beginnings. Luke thought he heard at once a faint sound carried by the wind. He halted his horse, listened, nothing. He nudged Dusty forward. Then he heard it again, a small, thin cry. Not the wind, not an animal. Something human, something scared. Luke sat up straighter in the saddle. How in God's name? He whispered, squinting through the blizzard. He dismounted, boots sinking deep into the snow, and cupped his hands around his mouth. Hey, anyone out here? His voice was swallowed immediately. For a moment he thought he'd imagined it. Then the cry came again, sharper, closer, desperate. Luke's heartbeat kicked into a quicker rhythm. He took a few steps forward, snow battering his face, and then he saw it. A small, huddled shape slumped beside a half-buried, fallen pine tree. Barely moving, barely alive. Lord Almighty! Luke dropped to his knees. A boy couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, lay shivering uncontrollably. His coat was soaked, his cheeks raw and burning from frostbite, his lips cracked and nearly purple. The child's boots were half torn, his gloves mismatched, his hat gone. He looked like he'd been running. Or worse, escaping. Luke didn't waste a second. He scooped the boy into his arms and staggered back to his horse. Easy, kid, I got you. You're all right now. The boy didn't speak, only whimpered weakly and dug his frozen fingers into Luke's coat. Luke mounted the saddle with the child cradled against his chest. The boy weighed next to nothing like a bundle of sticks wrapped in wet clothes, and through all the noise of the storm, Luke heard something else, a small whisper, barely audible. Please, don't let him find me. Luke's blood chilled faster than the snow around them. The storm hammered them relentlessly. Luke kept the boy pressed against him, shielding him from the worst of the wind. His own hands were numb, his legs burning from gripping the horse. The ranch felt impossibly far, but quitting wasn't an option. "Stay with me, kid," he murmured. "You hear me? Just stay awake." The boy didn't answer. Luke dug his boots into Dusty's sides, urging the horse on. Ice clung to the mane, to Luke's beard, to everything that dared to exist in that storm. Finally, after what felt like hours, Luke saw a faint glow through the white curtain. His cabin. A small ranch house tucked between two cottonwoods, smoke barely making it out of the chimney. Luke nearly slid off his horse in relief. He carried the child inside, kicked the door shut, and rushed to the fireplace. With trembling hands, he stoked the fire higher, wrapped the boy in quilts, and heated water on the iron stove. It took minutes before the child finally opened his eyes. Brown eyes. Soft, unsure, frightened. Luke knelt in front of him. "You're safe here." "What's your name, son?" The boy's lips trembled. My name is Samuel." Luke nodded. "All right, Samuel. You're gonna be just fine." But something in the boy's eyes, a shadow, a secret, unsettled him. Samuel held onto Luke's sleeve like it was a lifeline. "Please, don't make me go back out there." "I won't," Luke said. "You have my word." The boy relaxed slightly, though his breathing stayed shallow. Luke fetched a bowl of warm broth and helped him drink. Color slowly returned to the boy's cheeks. After a long silence, Luke asked quietly, "Where's your family? Someone out there looking for you?" Samuel hesitated, then shook his head. Luke didn't push, not yet. Instead, he leaned back in his old rocking chair, watching the child as the fire warmed the room. Something tugged at him, something he hadn't felt in years. A responsibility, a purpose. A kind of ache he recognized too well. He'd once had a boy of his own. Small hands, bright eyes, a laugh that filled the house. Until the fever took him and his wife 8 winters ago. Luke swallowed hard, pushing the memory away. This wasn't his child. Just a lost boy who needed help for a night, nothing more. Still, the way Samuel clung to him made Luke's chest tighten. As Samuel rested near the fire, Luke set his wet coat aside and heard something clatter to the floor. A small tin pendant had fallen from the boy's pocket. Luke picked it up. At first glance it looked like any cheap keepsake. But then he flipped it over, and his heart stopped. Carved into the metal, crude, uneven, but unmistakable, was a name. Harrow. Luke froze. He read it again and again. The boy was half asleep, drifting in, and out of consciousness, completely unaware of Luke's trembling hands or the storm raging harder outside. "Samuel," Luke whispered, voice tight. "Who gave you this?" The boy didn't answer, only whispered back, "Don't let him find me." Luke's breath shook. Harrow, his own last name. Impossible. No one carried his name, not anymore. His parents were gone. His siblings buried. His wife and child lost. He was the end of the line. Or so he believed. Luke's pulse hammered in his ears. He leaned closer, speaking softly. "Samuel, who are you?" Samuel's eyes fluttered open for a second, and the last words he spoke before drifting into a deep, exhausted sleep were, "My mama said, find Luke Harrow." "His family." Luke felt the room tilt. Family. The word hit him like a blow to the chest. Outside, the blizzard roared, rattling the window frames. Inside, Luke Harrow stared at the sleeping boy, this fragile, half-frozen stranger, and realized his life was about to change in ways he never expected. Then, from somewhere distant in the storm, he heard something else. A gunshot. Not far. Luke stood slowly, hand moving to the revolver holstered by the door. Someone was out there. And they were getting closer. The Wyoming night roared, a blizzard so fierce it swallowed sound and sky. In the small town of Cedar Hollow, folks were locked tight behind their doors, praying for the storm to pass. But one man pushed through it. His name was Luke Harrow, a quiet rancher who moved through the world like a ghost. Years ago, he'd lost his wife and son to a fever, and since then, the cold didn't bother him. He didn't fear much of anything anymore. He was on his way back to his isolated cabin when he heard it, a sound so thin and fragile, the wind almost tore it away. A cry. Luke pulled his horse to a halt, his head tilted, listening with an intensity that had kept him alive in these harsh lands for years. There it was again. A child's cry, desperate and weak. Without a second thought, he dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He followed the sound, stumbling through the whiteout until his eyes landed on a small shape collapsed beside a fallen pine tree. A boy, half frozen and barely breathing. Luke didn't hesitate. He stripped off his heavy coat, wrapped the child in its warmth, and lifted him onto his horse. He rode hard, the wind whipping at his face, the small cold body pressed against his chest. Back inside his cabin, the warmth of the hearth fire was a welcome shock. He laid the boy down on a cot, gently rubbing life back into his frozen hands and face. After a long, tense moment, the boy's eyes fluttered open. He whispered a single word, his voice shaking with fear. "Samuel." "Who's after you, Samuel?" Luke asked, his voice low and calm. The boy just shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "Please, don't let him find me." Luke noticed the boy's soaked coat was torn and heavy. As he carefully removed it, a small, dull tin pendant fell onto the wooden floor with a soft clink. Luke picked it up. It was cold to the touch. He turned it over, and his heart stopped. Carved into the metal on the back was a single word. Harrow, his own family name. Before he could process the shock, before he could even form a question, Samuel murmured, his voice faint. "Mama said, fund Luke Harrow. His family." Just then, the sharp crack of a gunshot exploded somewhere outside, cutting through the howl of the blizzard. Luke instinctively grabbed the rifle he always kept loaded by the door. He peered through the windows, but all he could see was the swirling white fury of the storm. Nothing moved. When he turned back, Samuel was sitting up, trembling uncontrollably. "He's here," the boy whispered, his face pale. "He followed me." "Who?" Luke demanded, his protective instincts now fully awake. The boy swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Elias Crow." "But he's not my real father." The story tumbled out in broken pieces, a tale of fear and desperation. Samuel's mother had lived with Crow, a violent ranch foreman known for his quick temper, gambling debts, and cruelty. Shortly before she passed away from an illness, she had confessed a secret to her son. Crow wasn't his real father. His true father was a man named Benjamin Harrow. The name hit Luke like a physical blow. He staggered back a step. Benjamin. His younger brother, who had left the ranch years ago and had reportedly died in a mining accident. If that was true, then this boy, Samuel, he was his nephew, the only family he had left in the world. Kin he never even knew existed. Suddenly, footsteps crunched on the snow-covered porch. A cold, menacing voice cut through a crack in the door. "Luke Harrow, I know you're in there. Hand over the boy. He belongs to me." It was Elias Crow. Luke raised his rifle, the weight of it familiar and steady in his hands. He moved to the door, his voice firm and low. "You're not taking him." From the other side, Crow laughed, a chilling sound. He promised he'd be back, that a little storm wouldn't stop him from taking what was his. Luke knew they couldn't stay. Crow was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. As the first hints of dawn began to break, the blizzard finally started to calm. Luke saddled his most reliable horse, wrapped Samuel in every warm blanket he could find, and lifted him into the saddle. He rode for Cedar Hollow, his mind racing. There was only one person he could trust, Sheriff Colton Reeves. In the sheriff's small, warm office, the smell of coffee hanging in the air, Luke laid out the whole impossible story. The sheriff, a man whose weathered face had seen it all, listened patiently, his gaze fixed on the small, quiet boy huddled by the stove. When Luke finished, Colton nodded slowly. "I remember Ben," he said, his voice thoughtful. "He told me once, a long time ago, that he had a son he'd never met. A woman he couldn't be with." He looked from Luke to Samuel. Crow must have known. He must have kept the boy as leverage. A child with a Harrow family name? That's worth plenty to a man drowning in debt. Luke's jaw tightened. The pieces clicked into place. Crow wasn't chasing Samuel out of some twisted sense of fatherly duty. He was chasing a payday, an asset. The boy was just a means to an end. The quiet anger that had simmered inside Luke for years began to burn hot. They didn't have to go looking for Crow. Crow found them. As Luke and the sheriff stood outside the office, planning their next move, a gunshot cracked across the quiet morning air, shattering the peace. The bullet splintered the wooden sign above their heads. The sheriff reacted instantly, shoving Samuel behind the cover of a water trough. Luke didn't flinch. He just stepped out into the middle of the snow-dusted street, his rifle raised and ready. From behind the stable, Elias Crow staggered into view. The journey through the blizzard had taken its toll. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, his clothes were tattered, but his eyes were wild with a feverish rage. "Give me the boy, Harrow!" he screamed, his voice raw. "He's mine." Luke stood his ground, a pillar of calm in the chaos. "He was never yours," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Crow fired first, his shot going wide. Luke dove, rolling behind a stack of barrels, and returned fire, pinning Crow behind a hitching post. The sheriff shouted for Crow to surrender, to drop his weapon, but the man was beyond reason. With a desperate roar, Crow charged forward, firing blindly, wildly. In that moment, Luke stepped out from cover, calm as stone. He raised his rifle, took a steady breath, and squeezed the trigger once. The shot was clean. The bullet found its mark, hitting Crow square in the chest. He stumbled, his momentum gone, and collapsed into the snow. He lay there for a moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and whispered, "He was all I had." Then he went still. The fight was over. Samuel ran out from behind his cover, not to the fallen man, but to Luke, burying his small face in his coat. For the first time in years, Luke wrapped his arms around someone firm, protective, and new. They'd buried Elias Crow in a simple grave on the edge of town. There was no crowd, no speeches. Just the cold wind whistling over the plains, a lonely tribute to a man who'd chosen the wrong path at every turn. Back at the ranch, the small cabin felt different. It was warmer, more alive. It felt like a place meant for two people, not just one. That evening, Samuel sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. He was small and quiet, a boy who had been through more than any child ever should. He finally looked up at Luke, his eyes serious. "Uncle Luke, can I stay here? With you?" Luke's throat tightened. The world he had built for himself, a world of solitude and quiet grief, was breaking apart to let something new in. He put a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder and nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, Samuel. You're home now." Outside, the winter wind drifted softly across the plains. It was no longer a threat, just a passing breath. Inside the small cabin, a boy who had lost everything found safety. And a man who thought he'd never love or protect anyone again found a purpose. The storm that had come to take a life had ended up saving two. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe for more. We'll see you next time.